Hello. Hi, Dr. Andrew Jolivétte. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. How are you, Dr. Capo?
Great. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Miami AIDS Memorials Project. I was wondering if we could start by you telling us a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself, and the work you do.
Yes. Ito'wi Hokisakus, Andrew Jolivet, Hiyak Ishak, Atakapo Ishak. Good day, relatives. My name's Andrew Jolivet. I'm Louisiana Creole of Takapo Ishak descent. And I'm a professor of sociology and Afro-Indigenous studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I've just started there, my first year. And prior to that, I was a professor and department chair of ethnic studies at UC San Diego for 5 years, and the founding director of the Native American Indigenous Studies program there at UC San Diego. And prior to that, for 16 years, I was a professor and also department chair of American Indian Studies at San Francisco State University. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in Ohlone Territory, currently live in San Diego in Kumeyaay Territory. And yeah, I'm a sociologist by training. Most of my scholarly work, though, is, I would say, multidisciplinary. I look at everything from critical mixed race identity to two-spirit community identity and belonging and wellness, issues around the sociology of public health, race, education, and representation. So I love to cook and dabble in a bit of poetry. And yeah, I'm just really happy to be able to talk to you today about the project you all are working on.
Thank you so much for that. And I've seen what you cook, and I think I've even had the chance to taste it before. And I just
Yes,
know the artistry of what you do, and I know how much your work means to so many folks. So thank you for all the great work that you do.
thank you.
Um, so I thought I'd get started by asking you, how you began doing work around AIDS, and AIDS and memory work in particular, but just how you got involved in doing
Mm,
AIDS work.
mm. When I think about it, and it's good you just sort of talked to me a little bit about this, so this is fresh, and so it's something new that I probably have not ever really talked about before. But my first memory of even thinking about these questions is I think about my uncle Charlie, who passed away about 9 months ago, almost going on a year. He was the first California Miss Drag. He won twice in the early 1970s, 1971, 72. And, a very out, proud gay man. He had to leave home at 15 when he came out. And, um, knew everybody in the Castro in San Francisco. And so, as a gay man myself, having a gay uncle who was married, right, to his husband, they got married in my grandmother's living room in 1982. And we're together until he passed away just last year in 2024 in March. And, a lot of his friends, I think about one of his friends in particular, Jamie, who despite the stereotypes of it, was a hairdresser. And um, I remember when Jamie had passed away, and no one really, kind of like Ronald Reagan, no one wanted to talk about or speak the words HIV/AIDS, although it was kind of on TV at this point, you kind of knew. But I remember him visiting our house in the Bayview Hunters Point area in San Francisco, a predominantly African American neighborhood. And I remember we had ate something, or people were there eating, or some kind of a party, I guess. I was really young, less than 10, I'm sure. And I remember my mom putting all the dishes in the sink and bleach and all this stuff. If she even, and then, or if she threw away. And then I was like, and I kind of overheard them kind of talking about it. And this was this whole fear, right? So I think my first memory, even of thinking about HIV and AIDS, is of the way in which there was all this stigma, right? The next memory that comes to mind was actually Pedro Zamora from San Francisco, the real world. A lot of people remember Pedro, right? I think for a lot of people, that's a memory. They came to my high school. Um, in Sacred Heart Cathedral High School in San Francisco in the downtown area. Um, this Catholic school. And so I think people were trying to do more. This was by that time, this was, I think, 1993. So I was a senior, 92, 93. And I knew in my mind, right, I hadn't come out or anything like that. I was kind of closeted, wasn't sure I was gay, but then just hearing him, seeing him, and also he was so beautiful. So I remember watching that show and knowing I was attracted to him, right? But then hearing his story, right, that it immediately had this sense of fear, right? I think a lot of folks of my generation, we were fearful. That was what society made us think about. The first thing that came to mind around HIV/AIDS was being afraid of one another, right? In certain contexts. And so I remember kind of being, let me not say too much during this presentation and everything like that. Fast forward though, myself, I had a couple relationships. My first actual same-sex relationship, I was 19 technically, so a little bit after that. Um, and the man was a couple years older than me, but he finds out after we kind of had some contact, not full on contact even, right? Just the minor stuff. But still very scary. I remember him saying, "Oh, I have to tell you something," because he had found out he had been tested a few weeks before that encounter, and he found out he was positive. And so I'm freaking out. I'm like, oh my God, but I'm negative, right? So, um, fast forward a few more years later, around 22, 23, I meet this guy. I'm in a relationship for 3 or 4 years. We break up, and then I find out that I actually, I get really sick, several months after we had broken up. This is I was 27 at that time. Um, and I went to the hospital. I remember I thought I had like a really bad cold. I was working at a middle school while I was in grad school at UC Santa Cruz working on my doctorate, and I was lecturing at San Francisco State. And um, I was a middle school dean at this school in San Francisco, and I was walking up the hill with the kids, and I couldn't really breathe. And then this cough just kept getting worse and worse. So finally, my parents were like, "You need to go to the doctor." They go to the doctor. They're like, "Oh, we'll do some, X-rays, and I think you just have a bad case of asthma." So they take these X-rays. I remember it was a Wednesday. They said, "We'll get back to you by Friday of this week." So it's just 2 days later, and let you know if there's anything more than that. If you don't hear from us, then yeah, it's just asthma. Here's your inhaler. So I go home, inhaler in hand, and by Sunday, I haven't heard nothing and I can't breathe in a resting position. And so my parents like, you have to go to the hospital. And I didn't want to, but my sister finally convinced me, drove me out to Kaiser Hospital. And they're like, you're really sick. Your oxygen level is 87. And we think we should take some x-rays. Since they come back out and they're like, oh, have you ever had sex with men? And I'm like, what? And they're like, yeah, you have pneumonia. It's on the front and back of your lungs. And we usually only see that in older people, like much, much older, because they have a compromised or weakened immune system, or in people with HIV/AIDS who have a compromised immune system. So, of course, then I'm freaking out, right? Long story short, the next morning, a doctor comes in because they're going to confirm what's going on. They give me the HIV test. Doctor comes in, turns the TV off, says, sorry, your results, you're positive. And I said, oh God. So I'm like, well, what does that mean? And here I am thinking I know, right? I'm getting my PhD. I'm kind of knowledgeable about this stuff. I've always been fairly safe and whatever safety means, right? Because I think it's this kind of thing that also is tied to when I think of memories of how people have talked about HIV and AIDS over my lifetime from being this kid, my parents, right? It was about safety, right? With Jamie, who, had touched and ate bowls, right? Then I think about this guy who I mess around with, and it's like, oh, well, what we did was quote safe, so I shouldn't have this, right? To then having this one partner who I'm monogamous with, to thinking, okay, so these kind of narratives that get created. So I want to kind of just call that out as something that's a memory that I think about that's tied to all of this. Um, so he says you have 32 T cells and your viral load's over 500,000 copies. So I knew that was horrible, at least the T cell part. I didn't really, at that point, actually understand viral load very well, honestly. So then when he explained the closer you are to a million copies, I was like, oh my God. He said, the closer you are to a million, the closer you are to dying. And I'm like, and I know I almost have zero T cells. And I remembered, Pedro's story, right? So I'm freaking out. I call my uncle, Charlie, who I was talking about earlier, and he's like, until they can actually confirm that you have, because they said we think you have pneumocystis, PCP, which is a particular type of pneumonia. Actually, it's, I believe the number one thing that was killing folks early on in the epidemic. And so they gave me Septra, which was a drug that actually I was allergic to, but thankfully saved my life because I thought I had liver failure because of the Septra. My liver enzymes were quite elevated, but I only had to take it for a few days. It brought that virus down. I got on the anti-retroviral meds at that point, and then I got a job at San Francisco State, and I met Rafael Diaz, an amazing friend and mentor who wrote "Gay Latino Men and HIV." And I remember talking with him a little bit, but also that middle school I worked at, Presidio Hill School in San Francisco, there was two grandparents, their granddaughter attended the school, Jordan Olive, and um, the Olives were wonderful people. Ann Olive was a lecturer at San Francisco State, or faculty member at San Francisco State, I should say, and the biology department. And she and her husband and a committee of other folks, Michael Ritter, who's now an ancestor who passed away recently, in the last couple of years that I just found out about. He was a big activist and organizer around HIV/AIDS. So I think about folks like Michael, who did so much important work around this topic. Um, they had all worked together to create this course called People of Color and AIDS, to bring attention to the overrepresentation of people of color in the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And when they found out I was going there, they said, "Well, they're like, why don't you teach this class?" Because I said, "Well, I have an interest in public health. Maybe I can help do this." And then when I got there, I end up, teaching this class. It's cross-listed already with the College of Ethnic Studies where I worked, and it became a very popular course. Raphael comes and does a lecture at some point, and one of the slides I saw was from this study, this Linda Valeroy study, where it was looking at multiracial youth, teens, in particular, young men. I guess it was young men, actually. I think it was 18 to 22-year-olds who were overrepresented in the incidence rates. And Raphael's like, Andrew, you study mixed race identity. You should look at why that's happening. So that ended up leading to, number one, me deciding, because had talked to Raphael and a few people knew about my AIDS status, right? Because I've always told people that it's, people say advanced HIV, but I also like to say living with AIDS, right? Raphael was the person who first said to me, said, it's really important to not say, I'm HIV positive, he used to say. A simple mindset can really change things. He said, saying that I'm living with this or I'm thriving with this. This was way before all these kind of campaigns, right? This is in the early 2000s, right? That he was kind of talking about this. And so I came out and disclosed my HIV/AIDS status on World AIDS Day, in 2009, 2010 at San Francisco State in front of my colleagues and faculty, students. I would come out and disclose in that People of Color and AIDS class that every year I taught it. Um, and you could see the way in which it changed people's perceptions about who was being impacted by HIV and AIDS, right? In really, I think, important and timely ways. So those are some of the ways in which I think I personally, right, was brought into this, but then also academically as teaching on this topic and area. And then as eventually then that question Raphael posed to me turned into a book, actually, Indian Blood, HIV and Colonial Trauma in San Francisco's Two-Spirit Community. Originally, that book, or the idea behind it, I was going to do a grant to do a research to look at ethnic specific healthcare organizations like the Native American AIDS Project, the Black Coalition on AIDS, um, Asian American Pacific Islander Wellness Center, Hermanos de Luna y Sol, where are these organizations in the Bay Area that were very ethnic specific, that were helping, in particular, gay men, um, and queer folks more broadly, trans folks, and comparing how their health and outcomes uh, matched up against going to general or mainstream places, whether that was San Francisco, like your General Hospital or Kaiser or whatever it might be, or a Stanford hospital or whatever. But it didn't quite materialize, and it seemed like it was too big because people said, well, if you want to look at this in terms of mixed race identity, that's so many groups. You're going to look at every one of those communities. So I said, well, the community I do most of my work around, and that's most represented in terms of mixed race identity, is actually the American Indian community. So I focused there, and that's how Indian Blood was born. And also, I was doing community work. I was, doing a little bit of work with folks from Bates, the Bay Area American Indian Two Spirits organization. Got involved a bit to work with the Native American AIDS Project. But at one point, I was on the Native American Health Center Advisory Board, Two Spirit Circle of Healing Advisory Board, where we were kind of trying to address some of these issues as well.
Goodness, Andrew. I thank you so much for this, for sharing all this with me. I wish I was there in person just so you can know how, because I feel so far away, but I'm, in this kind of distant virtual space, but just know how that I'm nodding, I wish I could just live anyway, that I could be in the closeness of being together. And I'm sorry for your loss with Charlie. I saw that online, and thank you for sharing your own personal story, for the story of Rafael, for Pedro, for there's thank you for sharing all of this with us.
Yeah.
I if I could, so what were some of the major findings of Indian blood, and how do you think that has shaped our understanding of how we think about HIV AIDS today?
Yeah, one of the very main things I think, one of the concepts that came out of this work that I think has struck people and that still seems to be present with people was this idea of radical love. And the way that I talk about radical love, and actually, I'm going to turn my camera off just for a second so you can see it because it's tied actually to this quote. I think you'll see it on the screen. It says, someone turned this into a shirt when I did a talk. This quote I said, but to turn our traumas and vulnerabilities into moments to change our lives is radical love, right? To turn our traumas and vulnerabilities into moments to change our lives is radical love. So, and then it says survive plus resist plus thrive equals thrivance. When I first wrote the book or started talking to people in the community, one of the things I first learned was I was really trying to understand mixed race gay men and mixed race American Indian gay men. And I wanted to move away from terms at that time that were about MSM, right? Things where people were trying to be very specific in the categories, right? Men who have sex with men. Um, and I wanted to explicitly name gay men in this experience, not people who maybe were talking about like, oh, well, we just don't identify as gay men, So that was part of it. Um, but one thing that I learned immediately was people said to me from NAP in particular, um, you have to talk about the trans community and our two spirit community members because they're overrepresented, they are forgotten and not talked about. And it was interesting that it coincided when I was doing the research around 2010. I started looking, but 2012 is when I really, really was. That's when the Bates Two Spirit Powwow, the first really Two Spirit Powwow of its kind, as far as we know, that's now run on its, I think, 13th, year. It's coming up next month in a couple weeks, actually. The annual Bates Two Spirit Powwow in San Francisco. I went there, interviewed people, surveyed people. Um, but one of the things that I learned, was not just about including trans folks, but this idea of radical love was really about vulnerability. I did focus groups to talk to people, and they were held at NAB. We would do prayer before and eat and try to form community and not just be there just to talk about this or to talk about being harmed. And not everyone involved or who participated was HIV positive. Some were negative, some were positive. Um, the idea was really to talk about what does it mean to what did it mean to be an American Indian person? Often it's very specifically tribal identities, right? Might it mean to be Dene or Navajo or Choctaw or something else, some other specific tribal community, and two spirit or gay if that was how they identified. But the idea of vulnerability that we can't heal until we actually face our vulnerabilities was something that I took away from that and that really radically changed my own life. to think about, for example, when we go to a therapist to address mental health issues, because we know one of the quote unquote risk factors, right? The way we describe people's risk factors for HIV/AIDS, we would say, oh, well, drugs and alcohol, mental health, incidents in our family, or life story, right? Something tragic events, right? So, how do we address those events, right? If they've already happened, right? We can't undo that. We can try to do prevention so it doesn't happen for other people. But really was about how do we address the now, right? So you go to a therapist and trigger warning for folks who are watching or listening and maybe have never heard or seen this, but when you visualize, so if you close your eyes and you visualize the word therapist, and you, after it's THE, if you stop and you put a line going straight down, after that E, it says the rapist. And I remember when someone first said that to me, actually, I was in high school and it was this advanced seminar we were doing, but they were talking about the ways in which historically, right, the way therapy work was done. I'm in therapy now and I'm not anti therapy. Um, but for a long time, there was this anti sort of therapy culture because we knew that when we were going into these places, this is a stranger. I don't know you. I've never met you. I'm just walking into this space. Yet I'm supposed to tell you the most intimate details of my life. It's just like a medical doctor. We're supposed to go into these same people, these same spaces that created some of these problems in the first place, right? That have made us feel quite alienated. And so I share that to say that I think often people would, instead of healing through, we look for cures, right? One of the things I've often said and learned in that work too is we're not trying to look for cures. We're trying because we have to heal. You're never really cured of something, right? And I think that's the thing that we struggle with is how do I continue to heal, right? And so, like for example, now, I mean, the HIV in my body, I should say, I didn't finish the story. I got on meds, I was diagnosed in October. By January, my viral load went up to 411. My T cell count went up to 411. My viral load became undetectable. It fluctuated a little bit at the beginning, but once it was undetectable, that was it. It was always been undetectable for what now going on, oh geez, 23 years this year in October. So I've been undetectable for about 22 years, and my T cell counts pretty much about over 1,000, I think, these days. Um, and so I'm not cured though, right? Even though essentially that means cured. Um, we're always healing, we're always, and that goes for any other kind of health thing, right? Is that we are continually thinking about how has this shaped my life and how does it continue to shape my life. And so the other thing I learned is that in the study for native folks, for our community, being mixed race, being in an urban space, you can lose connection to the kind of cultural buffers that maybe would have once helped and protected. Some of the quotes that are in the book, for example, talk about death and old people, right? One quote in particular that always stands out in my mind is someone who was saying when they left the res, they left because they were getting beat up, right? The res became this site rather than being one of for protection, it actually became that folks had internalized non-native ways of thinking about two-spirit identity, so it becomes this unsafe place. So how do we actually create kinship networks, right? One of the things I talked about was traditional urban Indian kinship networks, or TWICs, was the acronym that would cross generationally kind of support folks. And Bates is a space like that. The Native American AIDS Project was a space like that, where people could come together in a group kind of context almost with other folks who've had a similar experiences, right, as native, as mixed race, as dealing with HIV, either as something that you're trying to, not serial convert, or that you already have converted, and how are you living with it? So the argument that what I learned is, and in the book or argue is, it's not until we actually heal collectively, and that means being vulnerable, and face what's harmed us, then we can heal. And I think this is true of so many things. And so radical love, I've applied it to so many other things besides HIV/AIDS. And when I think about memory, right, and healing, I think about that notion of radical love. I wouldn't be here without the people who were doing the, ACT UP movement, the Compton, kitchen riots, right? My uncle, right, who, did this work, who paved these roads for us to be able to live our true and authentic selves, right? And just be humans, to find joy, right? And so I think also the book Indian Blood is really also about addressing stress. It was about addressing stress, but it was also about forming community and what I would today describe as circuits of joy that allow us to continue to do more than survive, right? Gerald Visner's work, where he talks about survivance, which was so central to Native studies and Native communities and organizing efforts, that I remember that we have to, something that happened to me, a memory that I should share. After my diagnosis, that's relevant to this, and that I share in the book even. Um, Shortly after my diagnosis and getting out of the hospital, I'd lost like 25 pounds, all this stuff. My friends, family were really worried. And some friends of mine organized a prayer meeting with a good friend of ours, Dan Freeland. Dan's daughter, Sydney Freeland, actually is a film director who's done a lot of great recent work in the Native community. That's sort of a side note, but Dan Freeland has an ancestor now, has passed on, but was a medicine person from the Dene Nation. And I remember Dan saying to me, Andrew, during the ceremony, he said, "You can't think of yourself as sick." He said, "That's part of the problem." And he said, "You have an opportunity here. So many of our brothers and sisters who are also dealing with the same thing that you have here, um, they may not be able to tell their stories. You can tell that your story. And so when you tell it, you're not just telling yours, you're telling part of their story too. Your brothers and your sisters, that's your medicine." And so I always took that to heart, and I share that with people today. And so I think I I don't stand on the shoulders. I stand with the spirit and the teachings and the organizing and all of the radical love, right, of many, many ancestors and people and relatives who before all of us, right, worked so hard to make sure that we would continue to be here. And so it's with that kind of purpose that Indian Blood was written, and to really say, how do we continue to collectively understand this, even as it's changed over time? How do we also continue to heal? So, particularly as we now think about so many people now, we're right trying to getting to zero, and in this country, having better sort of outcomes. And again, as I said, then it's still here though, right? Especially long-term survivors. How do we understand it in this moment now, or people who lost their entire families as a result, right, and have had to create new family in new ways? And again, that is where these kind of traditional urban Indian kinship networks, I think, come into play, which is one of the other things I learned, that cities, I know this project is looking at, how this has evolved in areas, in Florida. And I think if you think it, every major, or not even major, but just every city has its particular history, um, of not just survival, but and resistance, but thriving, right? And so I think that there's something really important about the collective energy and will that's allowed that to happen and to continue.
I could listen to you all day, Andrew. Thank you for you're such a powerful storyteller. The idea of healing, you brought so many kind of key points here. Healing as and as medicine, and this anchor of radical love, which is so central to everything you do, and for that I am just eternally grateful. You've touched on these things a little bit, but I wonder if we can maybe address a little bit more what the intended audience for this work, and a little bit about maybe some of the challenges or the benefits perhaps of this kind of method of doing focus groups. Like that is, what did doing
Mm.
focus groups bring to this story and to telling the story?
Yeah, thank you. So the audience really, and that's true of all my work, I've tried my best to do this. I by no means think it's been perfect, but has it been for the community? Um, I always tell people it's nice and everything to write for an academic audience, which I will say to, yes, of course, obviously to a certain extent, I'm also writing to other academics, um, so that they better understand these issues from different perspectives. What I was also trying to do with this book, I should say, was to bring these sort of disparate or seemingly disparate fields together. Public health, American Indian studies slash ethnic studies, and queer studies or LGBTQ studies, right? To bring all these different fields into better conversation with each other because they have not always been in good conversation with each other. And so that was one of the, the goals in terms of, and in terms of audience, was to speak to those different communities as well. It was to talk to mixed race communities, American Indian communities, Two Spirit communities, transgender communities, and also to non-native people and to white folk who don't understand. I remember going to my primary care physician who was a HIV specialist for many years, and she was a wonderful doctor, very good, very wise. And she said, I remember one time saying, wow, when I explained to her what I did and what I was writing about, I never, she was a specialist, right? A leading national specialist around HIV/AIDS. And she said, I didn't know. I would have never thought about mixed race identity as a factor or about American Indians being overrepresented, right? Because we're often forgotten and silenced. And so part of the work was also about bringing visibility to this. Some of the challenges, I think, as someone who's a Black mixed race native too, is like people, at points like, oh, questioning, like, do you understand these issues the same way, or are you really who you say you are? I think those kinds of issues, although the focus groups, I think, really help in that sense because you are not just getting people aren't just numbers, right? So focus groups as a method, because I also one of my areas I would say is as a methodologist. Right before this book, I had edited an anthology, Research Justice Methodologies for Social Change, which has become quite popular. This idea of research justice as a method that goes beyond CBPR, right? Or PAR methods. And the 10th anniversary, actually, because it's been such a well received book, is it's going to be coming out in April, the 10th anniversary. I've been working on that. Um, and so methodologically focused groups, you know, I think everyone really that does good research needs to talk to people. I think that theory is nice, and I think there's different ways you talk to people. Archivists or historians like yourself, you still are interfacing with people in the sense of when you're looking at old records or old letters or old memorabilia. I was involved also during this whole period. I should have mentioned, which I think you know this org, is the GLBT Historical Society and Museum in San Francisco, which has grown very much over the years. I started out with them as a volunteer docent after just finding out about them and going on a tour one day. And then I was like, oh my God, I want to volunteer here. And then I found out Amy was my good friend, and we both know Amy Suyoshi was involved. And then I ended up getting on the board and was board co-chair or co-board president with Amy for a period many years ago. Um, and so that some of these organizations too out there were so important in this work. But to get back to the focus groups, we don't want just more statistics or numbers because they only tell us so much. They don't tell us the necessarily what the why is. So, for example, one of the things we found, uh, sexual violence. Those who had experienced sexual violence, 100% of them were HIV positive in this in the work in the book. Those who identified as Two Spirit, 100% of those folks. were HIV positive, right? We saw higher rates of HIV/AIDS positive status. And so part of that, right, was understanding, okay, we could just say, oh, well, what's going on with those groups if I had just had the statistics? But then I could look at what people actually said, and I knew that because of sort of the colonial violence, or what I called two-spirit cultural dissolution, right? The dissolving of the cultural fabrics that actually uplifted traditionally two-spirit peoples, and cultural responsibilities or stewardship practices that are returning, and that not every tribe had, right? I also don't want to generalize, like not every tribe had this idea, right, where people are like, oh, two spirits were these revered people and blah, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the case in every tribal community. And some we that are documented, we know that two spirit people played a special role, an important role, as being seen neither as male nor female, and not as transgender, right, in the way in which we understand it today either, right? And so you don't understand any of that when you only do a quantitative or demographic survey and you don't actually talk to people. And then the other benefit, right? Because I'm going to talk to people individually, right? And the in-depth individual interviews or oral history interviews, right? Um, is you do possibly lose that effect of what I was saying. And I didn't know it at the time, of the communal collective space, which is in many cases a traditional kind of response or practice in many tribal communities. I'll speak for my own, the Atakapa Ishak, right? We have our concept in the Ishikoi language, Wihokisakus, which means um, we are all connected, or we are all in relation with one another. And so that's all things, not just human beings, but all things, right? And so when we have that in mind, we can't actually begin to heal, right, if we are doing it individually. And so it also destigmatizes some of the pressure. Like on the one hand, you think, oh, I'm going to be embarrassed and I don't want to talk about this in front of other people. And then yet on the other hand, if you create a safe space, people actually can feel more supported, right? Because you have more people there saying, yep, that was my story too. And laughter, laughter is healing. Like when I think back on those focus groups and the memories, um, I can just hear the people laughing. I mean, I can remember the tears as people talked about suffering from abuse. Um, physical, mental, emotional, sexual abuses and violences, but then also the joys and the memories of their grandmothers and their cousins and their aunties and their friends, or the beading circles in urban communities that gave them a sense of community and space when they didn't have one before. And that the focus groups themselves became that medicine is something else that I learned, and that was a healing, a part of that healing journey and process, and not just for the participants, right, as we say as researchers, but for myself as well, right? I was fully engaging in this as part of the community, and for so long we're taught that that's not good, that's not research, right? That's not good research. You're supposed to be devoid and objective and removed, and that's bullshit, right? That's fucking bullshit. I mean, at the end of the day, the best kind of research that we can do is actually purposeful, that is intentional, and that is rooted and grounded in who we are as people. And those who say they haven't been doing that actually their whole lives are liars, right? Historians, sociologists in the 1920s and 30s, the work they were doing always spoke back in some way to their own experience. I'm talking about white and European, right? Folks who were doing research. It always spoke back in some way to some part of who they were, even if it was just about explaining some phenomenon, but not really digging deeply into who they were as people, as whiteness became kind of this thing, right? That just was this big mass and didn't really get into true sort of ethnic kind of identity. Um, anyway, I hope I answered your question. I know I say more, I say a lot. So yeah.
You absolutely did, and thank you absolutely so much for that. And that the last segment in particular, agreed. And also congrats on the new edition of the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. Yeah, Mary Romero, who wrote Made in USA and storied sociologist, who I just love her. She's former president of American Sociological Association. She wrote the foreword to the book, so I'm excited about that.
When is it coming out?
April
April.
of this year. Yeah.
Congrats, I look for it. And to wrap us up, Andrew, if there's anything you want to tell us about how you want to be remembered, how you want your work to be remembered, um, how does the work, how do you want the work to live on beyond our
Mm,
time?
mm. I think I would come back to two things, but one which I already, the way in which I kind of started talking about this, and that's the radical love, right? That I think what I want to live on about this work and how I want to be remembered and the work to be remembered is, I guess it can be summarized in something I share often, and it's this thing my dad said to me as a kid in French Creole. Fais quoi tu vas faire, tu bug. Do what you got to do, little boy, and then you can do what you have to, right? I took that to mean he would always say like in reference to getting things done, like so you can go help other people or you can go enjoy life or that I hope that we understand from this work that it's, and which I sometimes say not even work, it's ceremony, right? That ceremony is not necessarily religious context all the time, is that I hope folks remember this as a celebration of radical love and inspiration to a higher purpose than just to oneself, but to one's community. And so that's what Faire Kwativa Faire means to me, is to be, that's what Indian blood means to me, is to be in um, community, to be in love with one's community, and to give. And I hope people remember that, right? Is that I hopefully have played my part and will continue to play my part. And that we all will collectively continue to play our parts, right? And be these circuits that allow the stars to keep shining brightly and movements to keep happening, especially in this moment, that we never give up. And from that strength, from that perseverance, coupled with, the trauma and the joy, that we will come out on the other side brighter, um, laughing with the sun on our face, the wind as our guide, and that the world will be a better place for, you know, my nieces and nephews, like my uncle and the generations before him made it better for us. And so I hope that that is the lasting impact, that we will continue to think about this idea of radical love, radical kinship, and community responsibility as a vehicle for healing and for joy. Yeah, for joy.
You most certainly have done that, Andrew, and I know that I and so many others are just eternally grateful for the work you've done, for the work you will no doubt continue to do, and just for your knowledge, for sh being so generous with your time and your insight and experience. Thank you, Andrew, so much for today and for everything you do.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Hiweo thank you very much. In Ishak and French. Thank you.
Thank you.